The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the distinct honour to rise in the House with regularity on issues related to the Canadian Forces and our veterans, because that's an important part of the reason why I ran for Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Most formative part of my life to date, my 41 years, were the 12 years I spent in uniform for Canada, joining the military at 18 after graduating from Bowmanville High School, attending Royal Military College, serving with the RCAF, transitioning into the reserves when I went to law school. And I've said in this House before that when I left, when you leave your military family and you hang up that uniform, that transition is a difficult time, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the decisions that flow around that are extremely stressful because in most cases our young men and women joined around the age I did, 18. I never wrote a resume, again, Mr. Speaker, until I left law school. You never had to apply for other jobs, but by the time the difference between 18 and your 30s or even later when you leave, you now have family, you'll have children, you'll often be in a province that's different from where you enrolled. So your life has radically changed. Changed for the better because I think almost every person leaving the military finds it to be a rewarding experience and something that they feel proud of for their life. And what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is the reason why the new Veterans Charter was created was to help our men and women with that transition. And I have to share the concern that my friend from Chilliwack, Fraser Canyon shared, how in recent years the debate has been lowered in this place by using veterans and programs like the new Veterans Charter for political gain, Mr. Speaker. It's been shameful, partially because this entire House supported the new Veterans Charter, including my friend from Sackville Eastern Shore, who's one of the few that have been here and worked on veterans issues for all those years. He voted for it, Mr. Speaker. Several other members of the Liberals voted for it, Mr. Speaker. It was a Liberal project, Mr. Speaker. But why parties came together is because they saw the need to modernize the transition of our men and women out of uniform. And that was the intention of the new Veterans Charter, Mr. Speaker, was to make sure that there was access to skills training education, health care faster, and that transition to civilian life was smoother. That was the intention. That's why every sitting member of the House voted for it, Mr. Speaker, under the Martin Liberal government. Now, the new Veterans Charter has been implemented over the course of our government. And the intention of that document was that it was to be a living document so that we could ensure that it could be reviewed from time to time, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? Our government has already acted when we increased the permanent impairment allowance and supplement for some of our most critically wounded soldiers from Afghanistan. Why was that done, Mr. Speaker? Because those most critically wounded have the most difficult time transitioning because it will be very hard because of their injuries to find permanent civilian employment after they leave the military. So already our government moved swiftly to address that major issue. And we've already put to the Veterans Affairs Committee, which I had the honour of sitting on for a year, my first year in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. That committee was charged by the current Minister of Veterans Affairs to review all aspects of the new Veterans Charter. Because what I've found in my talks with veterans around the country, Mr. Speaker, I still meet World War II veterans and Korean War veterans complaining about the old system, pre-new Veterans Charter, and how records were lost and how they couldn't provide support for claims and claims were rejected. So we've been listening, Mr. Speaker, and the new Veterans Charter was an attempt by the previous government and increasingly by ours to improve that transition period. We've also made good changes to the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, putting more veterans on the VRAB board, reviewing these sorts of claims, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to use a few moments of time here in the House to speak again about veterans issue. I urge some of my colleagues in here who use it as a wedge to actually learn about the issues a little more, Mr. Speaker, because I've been profoundly disappointed by the low level of knowledge. People are quick to complain, but very slow to actually research. And two quotes, one main quote really from the report by the Veterans Affairs Committee on the new Veterans Charter. Two parts of their report are critical for this House to consider, Mr. Speaker, especially the NDP who've brought this concurrence debate to the floor today. That all-party committee thankfully removed most of the politics from their operations. They heard from over 50 witnesses, veterans, veterans advocates, people with experience in mental health and in veteran care. And they put together a series of 14 recommendations, which I'll talk a little bit about. But importantly, Mr. Speaker, they unanimously agreed that the principles of the new Veterans Charter should be upheld. But improvements to the Charter was critical. They all recognized, members from all parties, that I will quote, the new Veterans Charter provides a, quote, solid foundation for transition from military life to civilian life. There are aspects with the new Veterans Charter that need to be improved and updated, but they unanimously agreed, Mr. Speaker, that the principles behind it in terms of assisting that transition were sound. They're just execution needed to be done better. And I said earlier, where was the origins of the new Veterans Charter was in submissions by many veterans, including some veterans groups that are now providing input on how we improve it, but a lot were asking for more upfront transitional support for men and women of forces, including those with injuries. And that's what the new Veterans Charter tried to do. It also tried to ensure that health care was part of the transition mix for people out of leaving uniform quickly, and that's still what it does. And, Mr. Speaker, I've heard a few members of this House just this morning in debate asking about the $4.7 billion number that's been discussed. I'm hoping some are listening now. A good portion of those funds are going to benefits from soldiers injured in Afghanistan and having enhanced benefits through the changes we already made as a government with the permanent impairment allowance and permanent impairment allowance supplement, Mr. Speaker. A good portion of that is that. But on a basic funding level, Veterans Affairs Canada, Mr. Speaker, has a budget that's about $800 million higher per year than when we formed government. So when I hear this government is cutting from veterans, it's actually one of the few areas, while we've been trying to get back to balanced budget, a principle that's important to our government, that has been largely spared. What I like most as a veteran, Mr. Speaker, and having worked after leaving uniform on veterans issues passionately for many years, is our government is not stuck in the 1950s in terms of how we care for our veterans. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. Some people still talk about the Veterans Affairs offices in this House. They clearly do not understand how veterans are served. Those offices were opened around the country, Mr. Speaker, at a time where there was no national health care in the country. The only offices the Government of Canada had around the country were the post office. There was no network of services. There was no health care. Offices were needed to administer to the entire generation that served and that needed care, and in some cases needed direct relationships with a physician who was a private operator. Fast forward to today, Mr. Speaker, and our veterans who are in some cases in their 20s leaving, who've never had a bank book. They want to access not just their banking information, but their veterans account on their smartphone or on their tablet. So I've said in this House a few times, we have to provide services that support our veterans in their 90s and in their 20s. And to do that, you cannot sit still. You have to provide a range of services. So what's changed from the 1950s to today, Mr. Speaker? Well, a network of almost 700 offices across Canada called Service Canada that weren't there before. We now also have health care administered through the provinces. And care for veterans can be accomplished through transfers and relationships with the provinces, including some of the facilities that the federal government used to own, Mr. Speaker, but have been transferred to the provinces because now we all know from the debates in this House, the provinces administer the healthcare systems in their province or territory. And so the federal government now has a partner in a relationship. And there's still some exceptional work going on at Camp Hill, at Sunnybrook, some of our veterans' hospitals, but they are part of the provincial health regime in their provinces, and they work with Veterans Affairs for care for our veterans. But that's what's changed, Mr. Speaker. So now, the same level of administrative support, because that's critical to remind Canadians, Veterans Affairs offices, the bricks and mortar office, did not deliver any services. They were an administrative centre. Well, now, that same level of administrative support can be offered at the network of 700 Service Canada offices, which didn't exist post-World War II, but do now. For my area of Durham, with 500,000 people, we never had a Veterans Affairs office, the Durham region writ large. People would have to travel into Toronto. Now, with Service Canada, that same level of administrative support can be obtained at 5 Service Canada offices in and around the edges of the Durham region, Mr. Speaker. That's smart governance. And anyone who says it's not is playing games. Some of the offices that were closed, Mr. Speaker, had less than 10 people in them a day. And in most cases, there is a Service Canada office that can offer the same level of support in the same building or down the street. You know, it disappoints me as a veteran, Mr. Speaker, that one veteran that's been highly critical of this, we actually took his advice, saying that the person in the Sydney office in Service Canada would not have experience with veterans. We listened to him last October, Mr. Speaker. I went to the minister personally. So we ensured that when the Veterans Affairs office closed in Sydney, that an experienced veteran caseworker was transferred to the Service Canada office. And with a caseload of about 10 to a dozen people a day, one is appropriate, Mr. Speaker, to provide the same level of administrative support and guidance. At the same time, over 15,000 veterans have signed up for the MyVac account to manage their own Veterans Affairs account online. Most of those are the younger cohort that I've talked about in their 20s and 30s, Mr. Speaker. But serving veterans is not about standing still. It's actually about doing things better and making sure we can serve more people. So that's what we're committed to. And if you want to get into what our government does for veterans, and I'm proud of my colleagues, this is a uniting feature of the Conservative Party and this government, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to serve alongside in Parliament, members who've served in the Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force, and we make sure this is a priority, and I can list it. There's 30,000 more survivors now receiving the Veterans Independence Program under our changes than before we took office. I think all MPs know veterans in their office or in their constituency that benefit from the VIP, an appropriately named program, to help them stay in their homes. Not only have we allowed more people to qualify for that with changes, we've made it easier. So instead of this administrative burden that families were telling us of submitting receipts, constantly doing this, mainly the children of veterans, there's now a case where you can be pre-approved for such service, and it can be done in advance. I've heard directly from people saying how much easier that is. We've supported great programs that have popped up in recent years, like the work Wounded Warriors has been doing with service dogs, like the group of physicians and scholars at the University of British Columbia have done with Veterans Transition Program and the Veterans Transition Network, dealing with veterans with OSIs or PTSD. That's been funded by our government to try and take that great work that UBC's been doing for about 20 years, since the Medak pocket of Yugoslavia, to take that nationally. We've increased and modernized the Last Post Fund, increasing both the amounts covered by the fund and extending it to modern veterans. Not to make sure every veteran has a funeral paid for by their country, because I know most do not want that. I certainly do not. But all veterans want to know that indigent veterans and those who have fallen through the cracks will have those services provided. And the Last Post Fund, Mr. Speaker, has done that for 100 years, and now will do it for the post-Korean War generation of veterans. We had the Veterans Hiring Act, where we're putting veterans as the top priority in hiring in the civil service, Mr. Speaker. Top priority. We know this won't apply to every veteran because you still have to be eligible for that post within the federal government. But it sends a message, Mr. Speaker. When Canada's Parliament puts an act and puts veterans in that position of top priority, we're sending a message to employers across the country that hiring a veteran is not just the right thing to do, it's actually accretive to your bottom line. You're hiring people with a track record of being able to work well on a team, take to training, and most people that join the military are inherently loyal. They want to affiliate with a uniform or a regiment. And so in an age where companies are spending millions of dollars on retraining and recruiting in the fast turnover parts of our economy, you hiring a loyal person can save you money in the long term. We created the Veterans Ombudsman, Mr. Speaker. I have the good fortune to speaking to Mr. Perron quite regularly on these issues. I came from an amazing life as a SAR-Tech, some of our most dedicated and brave members of the Air Force that saved Canadians. Now he's applying his passions to serving our veterans as the Ombudsman. And we take his reports very seriously, Mr. Speaker, as direct input that he's providing to the discussion on veterans care. On top of our changes to the VIP program, we've eliminated over 2 million forms of red tape that was burdening our veterans, Mr. Speaker, as a way of streamlining things. In some cases, our older veterans were having issues and falling behind on paperwork, or it was falling to their children to administer, Mr. Speaker. So we want to make it easier. Important commemorative things we've done, Mr. Speaker. I still meet Korean War veterans who thank us for a year ago making it the year of the Korean War veteran to recognize the 60th anniversary of the conclusion of that war, Mr. Speaker. That war has been described as the forgotten war because it came so close after World War II and was a UN-mandated mission. Our work on that, Mr. Speaker, and frankly the work of the Korean government recognizing our veterans as well has been empowering for a lot of our veterans. This year, I'm sure next week, a lot of members of this House will have the honor of providing 75th commemorative pins to veterans of World War II, Mr. Speaker. These are important symbols that veterans like to have for Remembrance Week and hand to their grandchildren or as part of their family memory of service. We also recognize Bomber Command, Mr. Speaker, with a bar for their decorations. And it was posthumous as well, Mr. Speaker, so families could complete the service medal set of their grandparent by adding the Bomber Command bar. That was important, Mr. Speaker, because Bomber Command actually had the highest casualty rates of World War II. And the young men that went and flew on those missions were courageous. And after the war, because of the nature of those missions, it wasn't talked about, and they weren't properly recognized. Well, there was a lovely exhibit in London, England, Mr. Speaker, that many of those veterans attended, and the Bomber Command bar is a way that we can commemorate that as well. As I said in my remarks before in this House, we've also heard talk, when I brought up the important role the Legion plays in the care of our veterans on a political program, I was mocked for that position, Mr. Speaker. Well, the only thing that predates the post-World War II bricks and mortar offices are the Legion. The Legion and their network of 1,300 veteran services officers since the 1930s has been helping our veterans directly, and their mandate comes from an Act of Parliament in 1926. So, Mr. Speaker, there's 14 recommendations from the Veterans Affairs Committee on modernizing and evolving the new Veterans Charter. We've already acted on 4 of those, Mr. Speaker, the most important of which is to make sure that a veteran is stable medically before they're transitioned out of the Canadian Forces, and to make sure that they're briefed on Veterans Affairs and their caseworker. I think most MPs would find that's usually the gap where a problem to the service or benefits of a veteran happens, because they leave one institution, the Canadian Forces, that they sometimes joined at 18, and they transition to an entirely new department. We're now making it mandatory that they're stable and they have the Veterans Affairs training. The other parts of the recommendations we're reviewing and will act upon, Mr. Speaker, because we're committed passionately to our veterans. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy River.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to take a moment to thank this member for his service to our country and his continued service to our country as a member of Parliament. He is right in many of the things that he says, in particular the ability of the Veterans Affairs Committee, all parties, to get along and move forward to help veterans. We've all tried that, and it was unanimous support. I'll be speaking shortly in this debate, and I hope the member will listen closely as I talk about some of the facts and figures that he was mentioning. I'd like to ask the member. He talks about the 700 service points, 625-ish or so Service Canada points, where service is now available to veterans. And one of the concerns I've had, and I can speak to him later about a particular veteran who did not receive proper service in my riding at Service Canada. But I wonder if he could outline for the House, just very briefly, the sort of training that is going on in each of those Service Canada service centres to ensure the veterans are getting the right service. I understand that there is about an hour and a half training, a video training that goes on in those service centres. I wonder if he can either confirm that or perhaps illustrate to us a little closer, a little better, what is the service for all of those employees in each of those service centres.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River, for the question. And I know his community was impacted as one of the 9 centres where there was an office closure. He knows there's a Service Canada office nearby, or I think in that case of Thunder Bay, about 2 kilometres away. That's a good question. So for those offices, and that one in particular, where there was a closure, there was a transferred Veterans Affairs officer, a caseworker, who is fully knowledgeable and experienced specifically with veterans, including the demeanour and sort of empathy required for helping them on an administrative level. The rest of the Service Canada network, that's a great question. The rest of the network has received what's considered Level 1 training, which is a training on the overview of veterans' benefits, the types of forms, and the types of queries that would come in on a daily basis. Because most of them, about 80% of queries, tend to be the same types of questions about benefits or survivor benefits, those sorts of things. There's an intention to also do another level of training, and I know that's being looked at, so that those caseworkers will have a good summary of the full body of knowledge that they can assist a veteran with when they come to a Service Canada office. But it's important, as I said in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, now you don't just have to live nearby a Veterans Affairs office. Now you can actually use the Service Canada offices or the 1,300 veteran service officers of the Legion, who on a regional basis, their district Legion Veteran Service Officer Commander has a direct line of access into Veterans Affairs. So if anyone is falling through the cracks, we've got to remedy that, Mr. Speaker. But this is about serving more and serving a wider cross-section. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very glad we're talking about this important issue as we come towards Remembrance Day. And I also looked at the response, both the report that was done by Veterans Affairs Committee, and I really want to congratulate them on having a report that had consensus of all parties. The government, of course, responded to that report, and they are taking some immediate action on a number of the recommendations. Also, though, I think it's important to point out some of the recommendations have a little bit more complexity, so it'll take a little bit more work before we can actually move forward. I would really like the honourable member to talk about how some of the action that has been taken already in terms of moving those important recommendations forward, and also a little bit about what the future is for some of the other recommendations. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, and certainly I know of her passion for our veterans and on these issues. As I said in my remarks, the report that came before the last session of Parliament ended in the spring produced 14 unanimous recommendations, and many of them are good ones. Many came from the over 50 witnesses that appeared from across the country at the Veterans Affairs Committee. We've already moved on 4. I spoke about the most important one, which is to make sure that a medical condition is stabilized and some basic veteran case management setup is done before someone's transitioned out of uniform. But there's some other important ones. We've already indicated that we're going to move forward on adding a construction clause and Bill of Rights right into the new Veterans Charter in terms of a Veterans Bill of Rights. We're already looking to harmonize the new Veterans Charter and CICIP, and to do that better, that will eliminate some duplication and probably provide more benefits to more veterans. Another important thing is we're going to provide more direct financial support and training for home-based caregivers. So usually the partner of the veteran who, and I've seen this firsthand, become a primary support both mentally and physically for a veteran who's recovering. There's going to be more financial support for the families in that regard. And we have said clearly we're going to review the disability award process to make sure that it's robust and provides what is needed. The one thing that's often overlooked in terms of the disability award up front is the fact that a lot of people don't talk about the suites of benefits that also follow in some cases for life. Exactly. And you have to look at the care of the veteran over their lifetime. This isn't comparing someone to a workplace accident or a car accident. There is a suite of care for our veterans. So there's an upfront payment to help with that transition, but you have to look at the totality, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech, which I listened with great intent. I think there's often a great deal, and this is what the public generally sees from the House of Commons and elected officials, a great deal of conflict that goes on between us, some of it feigned and some of it actually quite sincere, about different policy options and choices that the government makes and the opposition opposes, as is the nature of our system. Around veterans, there is a possibility, I would argue, to find more common ground more often than we have in the past, simply because we acknowledge, regardless of our political affiliations, the service that has been paid to this country by so many veterans over so many generations. Our challenge is when the government comes forward with new policies, as they did in the Veterans Charters and others, where they try to apply a one-size-fits-all. We talked about the benefits and the payments coming out as a lump sum, and many veterans resisted that. And many veterans told this government that at the committee and said, this is not a program that works for us over the length of our disability. I think what needs to happen is a little water in the wine when it comes to veteran services from the government to avoid the conflicts that keep happening with veterans groups themselves, not from people in the opposition benches, but people who have gone through the veteran system, have been pushed out of the military too early before they could qualify for disability. We've had those cases and the government's aware of them. We need to improve the system. I think we can all agree on that it's not doing the full service that it could. My question is this to my friend, as this is a topic, of course, as we come towards Remembrance Day, needs to be a topic all year round. A concern that many veterans have come to me with this new model of Service Canada treatment is that with the effects of PTSD, some of them still unknown as we learn about the true injuries that happen that are not seen, are we always bringing people to that service that are qualified enough to handle the complexity of something like psychological disabilities, like injuries that have happened that are not perceived on the body but are having huge and detrimental effect not only on the veteran but on that veteran's family and community?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, as the Minister of International Trade, you just have a little more than a minute.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley for his intervention and for his suggestion. I do think there is more common ground, and I think the Veterans Affairs Committee demonstrated that. One thing I'll note, he even fell into the mistake that some made when he talked about Service Canada and talked about treatment at Service Canada for people. Treatment's the wrong word. They are not providing the frontline treatment, but are helping that veteran access the range of treatments. You know, our Veterans Affairs Committee heard from 2 veterans that I've known for many years and admire. Both happen to be from his province of British Columbia, Chris Linford and Tim Laidler. Both are involved in programs directed at operational stress injuries. Tim Laidler at the Veterans Transition Network, and Chris Linford and his wife are doing one called the COPE program that's actually for families. What our government has been doing in recent years, Mr. Speaker, particularly on mental health, is there isn't one single solution that fits the needs of all veterans. So we're finding that in some cases, equine therapy that CAM Praxis and others are offering, or the Veterans Transition Peer Counseling, or the family-based COPE program, we need a variety of options for our veterans, and most of the time that's going outside of Veterans Affairs and to providers in healthcare or in veterans advocacy fields. We've tried increasingly to fund these programs either on a pilot or a permanent basis to make sure that there's a variety of programs to help the diverse needs of our veterans with mental health.